So I'm Amy Robinson, and I am the news director at WCMU, and we're here today to talk about water. Thank you for coming out. This is a newer initiative for us, and somewhat newer nationwide, I believe. We got some training on community conversations from the Humanities Council in Oregon, and they do a lot of them out there. But the point of tonight is really to give everyone a space to connect, to hear some other thoughts about this issue of living on the water and a sense of place, and to kind of share perspectives in a civil and fun conversation. So that's the big picture of what we're looking at. Let me introduce a few people as we get started. Linda Dielman, who greeted many of you when you came in, is our outreach coordinator, and she did a tremendous amount in putting all this together. Mike Horace at the back table, wave Mike. Mike is our morning edition host for any of you who listen to WCMU, and he also is our operations guy. He is the person we go to when we have questions about how stuff works, especially if Sean is tied up. Sean there is our operations manager and loves to get out on the road and do events like this and just problem solve. He's like in his happy place if he can problem solve and be out doing stuff in the community. Chris Ogazali, hiding behind the camera. Hey, Chris. He is our TV director. So that leads me, and did I get everyone? No, I want to thank Jennifer Rupp, who is with us tonight from the Michigan Humanities Council. Hey, Jennifer. And that is one of our funders. The Michigan Humanities Council provided the grant so this conversation could happen, kind of in conjunction with the National Endowment for the Humanities. So we're very happy to have Jennifer here today. Thanks. What we're going to be doing today is this. We're going to start out talking with our experts. What we found in an earlier conversation we had is that while we really want to hear from you and we want this to be a conversation, the participants really loved having experts here because they can offer a perspective that might even be unique to anyone else in this room and have a knowledge base from working in this area that can kind of help tie things together or advance the conversation. And so I'll be talking with them for a few minutes to start, and I'll be introducing them in just a minute. And then after that, we're going to get on with the conversation. We'll have a couple of, and I know everyone loves this the most, kind of icebreakers. And then we'll, start talking about the issue of water and living on the water and a sense of place.
Amy, could I mention, someone asked me if I was going to explain the pieces of paper that were on your seats and tell you before the conversation starts?
Yes.
It's a two-sided piece of paper. One is giving us permission to use your voice and your likeness in this production that we're working on. So we need that to be legal. And then if you flip it over, you can share some contact information for yourself, and then why these topics were of interest to you, why you wanted to be here tonight and to take part of this. So if you'll just fill those out and give them to me before you leave tonight, and if you want to make mention of the wrestling paper message too.
Yeah. So some other housekeeping things. Once we start our conversation, if you have these papers and don't mind setting them down, right in the middle, these are microphones, and this is an array mic. And so it's picking up the entire circle, and it does a pretty good job, but it picks up anything. So it's going to hear your voice if you lean over and whisper to your neighbor. I'm not saying you can't do that, I'm just letting you know how this works. And it's going to hear rustling paper, and when we listen back to it, it's going to treat it all the same, and it's all just going to come through, we hope, very clear. So the more we can minimize extra noise, the better our audio quality. We're planning to use audio from tonight for an hour-long radio program. We're conducting 3 community conversations centered around water, and each one will have its own hour-long radio program. So this one will be used, obviously, for living on the water in a sense of place. Additionally, we may be using audio and video for online web-based pieces as well. If you don't mind at least silencing or turning off your cell phones, I don't think the equipment's going to pick up on it too bad if they happen to be on. Sometimes it causes interference with the equipment, but as long as they're not going off in the middle of the conversation, we appreciate that. And bathrooms, if you need them, It's delightful because it's this trek you get to take. So you're going to go down the stairs and then down the next stairs. So just keep going downstairs till you're, I think it says 1. And you're going to go through what looks kind of like an art room. It looks like an activity room, a community room. And you walk into this yellow room. That's how you know you're getting close. And then you'll see, yeah, it's fun. And you'll see the ladies' room on the left and the men's room over on the right. So it's a little bit of a walk, but just keep going down the stairs and you'll get there. All right, so we're going to start by talking to our experts to get the conversation underway. And this is Emily Proctor. And Emily, go ahead and tell us your title.
Tribal Extension Educator for Michigan State University Extension. And but first of all, Baju, Odaminquay Indigenous, Magizi and Dodom, Atikamek and Donjaba, Harbor Springs and Dodom. So what I did is shared with you who I am in our traditional language of Anishinaabe-Moan, and I am Emily Proctor, a strawberry woman known in our community. My clan is Eagle Clan. I live in Harbor Springs, but my family is from Cross Village. And I am with Michigan State University Extension, a tribal extension educator, and I've been asked to work with our tribal nations, our tribal communities across the state of Michigan in the arena of good governance, leadership, community engagement, at times geriatric education, and being able to assist our communities in whatever ways my tribal leaders ask me to do. In another arena, I am on our Little Traverse Bay Bands of Odawa Indians Tribal Council at this point in time. Regrets for having me.
Thank you for coming. So let's talk about the issue of a sense of place and living on the water, because your community's life on the water is long and deep.
Yes. So our community here, Little Traverse Bay Bands of Odawa Indians, we come from long lineage, time immemorial of being in this place. Land of the Crooked Tree, you might have seen, Waganuxing Odawa. Our community is made up of 9 bands. We've lived along the water. We've lived, we've thrived, we've hunted, gathered, grown agriculture. We've traded on our waters. Our community is water community. We're known for our giaman, our canoes, for traveling the inland waterways for commerce. And we're also known for, I would say, a good way to put it is we've also not only lived on the water, but we've also, along the shore, have utilized the shoreline as a place to rest our loved ones as well. So water means more to us than recreation, right? It's a place of sustainability, sustenance, our fish. We use it to water our plants. We use it, it's a place that houses our ceremonial beings, our culture, our identity. And I'd like to say that whatever happens to the water, whatever happens in the water happens to us as Anishinaabe, but also to all of us as folks who live in the state of Michigan and around the Great Lakes. So water is a direct correlation to how we thrive, live, and our well-being here in our homelands of the Anishinaabe, Odawa here at Little Traverse.
So as we look at that, using water for sustenance, for recreation, for ceremonies, and being so much at the heart of who you are as a people, it's very similar to what we see today with human beings and water. What kind of message, what kind of issue as we talk about water today would you say is very important from a tribal perspective to consider?
I would say, well, 2 offhand. 1 being that water is life. Water gives us what, not only spiritually what we need, but medicinally, right? What food, for shelter, for livelihood. It's the essence of who we are as Anishinaabe. And 2, I would say it's also tied to our political identity as well. So during treaty signing, and there's many stories, and if you talk to many folks in this room, you talk to our elders, folks who lived in the community, there's such a deep, the river, if you will, runs deep with the stories that we have that's connected to water. And one story I'd like to share with you is during the treaty signing era. And this was during the time of Trail of Tears, when there was much Indian removal in communities across the nation, right? Folks were being forced out west. We had communities here in Michigan that were forced out west and that are still there to this day. Here, in this part of the state of Michigan, we had the federal government saying you have 5 years in order to find a home, move out west, make that move, take your families, take your children, and go. Well, we had an individual that we sent, a scout, out west to look at Kansas, to look at what lands that we were being asked to be removed to. When they came home, they said, we're not leaving. This is our home. There is no water. There are no trees. Our medicines aren't there. Our sacred items, our spiritual beings, our spiritual places that are along the shore are not out west. They're here in the homelands. And we've had folks for thousands of years who have strategized, who have learned many languages, who have worked across government agencies to the best of their ability to retain presence here in Little Traverse, in the Great Lakes. So my message is, what happens to the water spiritually, if there's pollution, if there's anything that occurs, impacts us as Anishinaabe too. It's the right that we as Anishinaabe have continued to retain for hundreds of years since colonization.
And I want to briefly touch on something we talked about before the conversation, and that is that the shoreline is where the Anishinaabe buried their loved ones.
Oftentimes, yes.
Yeah, and so that to me is a really interesting piece of sharing the water, of living on the water, and so that's an issue you still kind of deal with today.
We do. So you'll notice, and if folks are interested in learning more, the Native American Graves Repatriation Act. And what that says is if there's, and this is for public institutions who receive federal funding or state funding, that if you have remains of traditional ceremonial items, of burials from indigenous people, so if we had any in museums or other areas of who receive public funding, those remains are to be brought back home. And so when you have development, when you have excavation, or you have things that are happening along the shore, it's important to be mindful that at one point, and continues to be actually, homes for our loved ones who have passed. And within that contains our loved ones, but potentially ceremonial items. That doesn't really affect, to my knowledge, private landowners, but I would encourage you to seek out individuals who have their expertise in NAGPRA. But when you're developing, or when you are hunting, or when you're gathering, we Anishinaabe have remains out along the shore of our loved ones. So just to keep that in mind as well.
Interesting. Thank you very much for being here today.
Much.
And our other expert, Brandon Schroeder, with Michigan Sea Grant. Did I get that right?
That's right. Yeah.
Okay. All right. And so you spend a lot of time in shoreline communities. What do you hear as some of the big issues?
Yeah, so my role with Michigan State University Extension is as a Sea Grant Extension educator. I come to you from the Lake Huron side. I serve northern Lake Huron communities, but our program is a program of NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, so we're the O in NOAA, and we focus on ocean sciences, but our oceans are these great freshwater, Great Lakes, the 20% of the Earth's surface freshwater available to us. And I think what our Sea Grant program does is really think about how do we promote science so that we can use science to take care of these coastal and Great Lakes resources, because we know they're extremely valuable to us. And I always kind of start into this conversation that Michigan is extremely rich in Great Lakes and natural resources, and we have a lot of values in these resources. A lot of our coastal communities get drinking water from the Great Lakes. We go to the beaches. We watch birds migrating down the coastline. We put our boats in the water, paddle along the coastline. But probably my area of interest is the fisheries. I work a lot with the Great Lakes fisheries, particularly on Lake Huron. And it really strikes me that everybody has a connection, not just to the water, but to the fish, right? Every person has a value in those fisheries resources. They might be fun to go out and recreationally catch. They might be a food source. We have an active commercial fisheries on the Great Lake, or I might be taking home that prize catch of the day for the dinner table. And we know that those fisheries, the 180 species of fish swimming around up there, all provide important ecological functions. They define our sense of place. They're a resource we value. They also provide economic values to our communities.
And you also have a number of constituencies looking to enjoy the fishery, profit from the fishery, make their livelihood from it. And it just feels like there's kind of a constant balance that has to be navigated over this kind of thing.
Yeah, so one of the neat things about Michigan and the Great Lakes is these are public resources, right? And so Michigan is known for its public access, and our Great Lakes are a tremendous public resource, and we all have access to them. And so when you have this tremendous fishery, there's a lot of different interests and values in terms of how we use that fishery. So whether it's a recreational angler or a charter boat captain, a recreational angler who's fishing for fun, or a charter boat captain who's fishing for business, a state licensed commercial fisherman, or a tribal fisherman with a long history and heritage tied to the fishery. Everybody looks at that fishery in a little different way, but everybody has a most definite value in taking care of that resource because it provides a service of value to us. And it's something we get excited about and passionate about.
And so we have the fishery, and we also have then issues around water withdrawal, issues around pollution, even just the general lake levels coming and going. And so as we think about this sense of place and sense of community, there's also tied inherently to that is a sense of responsibility. And when I bring that up in this case, I happen to be thinking of invasive species, because that's one a lot of people can really impact.
Yeah, I think, so whether you live in Mount Pleasant or whether you live directly on the coastline, the Great Lakes are all interconnected. Our watersheds are connected to the Great Lakes are connected to the ocean, so this tremendous water resource on Earth is all interconnected. We all have a responsibility to that, right? So we are all attracted to water, and we have a shared responsibility for taking care of that. In my mind, that makes, regardless of how we look at the fishery, we all have some of these shared issues or concerns. Water quality, habitat degradation. You can look at issues like climate or issues like invasive species. Invasive species have most dramatically reshaped our Great Lakes ecosystems multiple times now, and those have tremendous impacts on the social, the economic, and the ecological values we place on those fisheries. So issues like climate or invasive species are shared issues. It doesn't matter if you're a commercial fisherman or a recreational fisherman. It doesn't matter if your business and livelihood depends on it or you're just doing it for fun. We all have that shared issue and that shared responsibility of caring for these resources.
All right, very good. Thank you for coming today. So what we're going to do now is, after I asked you a minute ago not to crinkle papers too often, I'm going to give you some papers. So go ahead and just take one and let me check one thing here, sorry. Okay. And go ahead and pass those around. Some of you are going to be super fortunate because I accidentally copied it on letterhead stationery. So ignore the part that says WCMU. We're going to use this picture as just a kind of a jumping off point to get your impressions of life on the water, this sense of community, responsibility, and benefits. I mean, all of these issues. So I guess what I'm going to ask you to do is, once you get the image, just sit with it for a minute, and then I'm going to ask you to share some of your thoughts about it. As we get going on that, I'm going to mention, we all know from being in groups before, some people are very comfortable sharing in a group, and we encourage you to do that. Some people are not as comfortable, and we really encourage you to speak out as well, because that's how this happens in the best possible way, if everybody shares. And if you are very comfortable sharing, kind of keep an eye on the people who may not be as open, and leave them a space, or maybe even encourage them to join in as well. This picture was not taken around here. As you look it over, if you have some thoughts on it and how it relates to community, water, responsibility, just please feel free to share.
Is this in Southeast Asia?
I don't have the exact location.
No?
Yeah.
It's like Philippines, Southern Philippines.
You can tell that it's an area that's used to having water overtaking it. You see a lot of boats and means, but not a lot of vegetation.
I assume that this is a water community.
They live on the water.
Yeah, if you ever visit communities like this, this is their house, this is like their full-time neighborhood. Home, yeah.
On PBS, Nova just did a show not too long ago, you guys repeated, that involved one of these communities. So they learn to swim essentially from birth. They deep dive. There is nothing they don't get from the water. But on the return, everything wasted is in the water. And they live with whatever poison floats by, and they create whatever poison goes in.
And this is where, I mean, not quite like this, but communities like this is where almost all of our shrimp comes from in the world. It looks like it would be slightly less dense, but floating rafts, and I visited one of these and have never eaten shrimp since.
Really?
Because of what Tom just said. There's no sewer line underneath the water here.
When you talk about living on the water, it doesn't get much closer than that.
No.
With all of that means, I guess, pro and con.
Now, this could be Miami in about 100 years.
I was
Why wait 100?
as property values rise in our division, and we can't afford to live on the land anymore, households may become in.
Yeah, I mean, this is what a lot of the Midwest looks like right now along the Missouri and Platte River.
Yeah.
I almost pulled one of those
Yeah,
pictures.
I mean, they just showed some NASA satellite images this morning of those rivers at flood stage, and there's whole neighborhoods that look like this, with no intention of living like this.
Right.
Is this a tangential discussion? I mean, I have a son who's on the Sustainability Commission in Washington, D.C., and this is what they're talking about with Washington, D.C. over the years on the Potomac and down close to the ocean, is how do we keep our swampy land from becoming this? And now all the counties in Maryland are having similar commissions. So that's already ongoing, and they're getting people on this commission in D.C. from all over the country, big corporate bigwigs being involved. So I mean, this, and being from Alaska, there was a lot of bush communities that have already moved for years before you even heard about climate change. Back 20, 30 years, this has been going on along the coast of Alaska. I mean, I was born there in '58. This has been going on for years, and nobody's ever heard about it.
And I was born in Washington, D.C., and people were
Oh, yeah.
just starting to talk about it. But I mean, this type of issue was a huge part of my coursework in college, and it's one of the main reasons I live here, was because I didn't want to move to any location where in my lifetime or my children's lifetime, we would end up being a climate refugee. And so we really consciously tried to move to one of the most secure locations for the next 100 years. And all these models exist. I mean, it's pretty easy to see where not to be, and it happens to be where most people are. So you end up here.
So as you look at the sense of place and how people love to live on the water and the challenges that come with it, we're even looking at potential challenges greater than Asian carp, or other sorts of pollution, or balancing out who can use the resources. There are also issues related to global impacts, really. Is there anything you see in there that you see as a positive from living on the water? It's an extreme example of living on the water.
Well, in our, if I may, in our arrogant society way, we look at this as maybe like not good, but in their culture, this is wonderful. I mean, this is what they've grown into and have been birthed into, and there is no right or wrong with this. This is life. There is no class or poverty. It's just, this is life. This is what we do. So I guess as a positive, I think we don't tend to look at things that way. We tend to look to see where do they plug in their big screen TV and where's their internet. And for them, this is a wonderful place to be.
But home is home wherever you're from, and I think one of the biggest challenges we face as a culture is that this doesn't look like home, but suburban developments and 4-lane highways and everyone having a car looks like home. And frankly, this is probably more resilient than our way of life. Though it wouldn't seem that way on the outset, but a lot of things that we rely on are quite fragile in nature. And I'm not saying this would withstand a tsunami, but if the level of the ocean rises, they'll just rise with it. And all of our homes and foundations won't.
And looking in this picture, one thing that comes to my mind is that they must have an immense respect for this water because it surrounds them. They're connected to some water no matter what. So whether they have to go, like you said, whether they have to go to school, whether they have to, whatever it is that they have to do, once they go outside their door, the water is right there. So it's not like when I'm over here at the Little Traverse Bay, I can go and walk down, to go fishing or, go walk down in the pier, whatever. No, once they leave their door, it's like they have to coexist with this water. So, I guess one of the things that I try to do in the work that I do is like, how do I get people to connect with water so that emotionally they connect with it? It's not, oh yeah, I'm gonna go sailing, or it's this thing that they just enjoy. And like Emily was sharing, it was like, without water we cannot exist. If you have ever had your pipes frozen in the wintertime, you will pay $1,000 to have the plumber to come in and turn on your water. Your heat could go out, your electric, but without that water, it's like you can't exist. Our body's like 70% water. So for these folks, they know how to coexist with it, and that's the thing. It's like that's my takeaway from this picture. And I noticed that the community is very close. So, when something happens in their community, but related to the water, it's like all of them are going to be affected somehow. The way he was talking about the pollution and things like that, or tsunami, or those types of things.
Well, if I could jump in, one of the things that strikes me as you guys are talking is something I think about a lot, is how incredibly important water is in life, right? Life on Earth depends on water, and life on land depends on fresh water, but how incredibly destructive it can also be, right? And the risks, the high-stake risks of not having access to water or fresh water can be devastating, or flooding, or sea level rise, or any number of challenges that come with that. So it's so important, yet the risks, it can also be so devastating. So I feel like I've heard that a couple of times, and it's something that always strikes a chord with me.
And it just happened in Mozambique and Malawi this last week. They had a typhoon, the likes of which many people there had never seen in their lifetime. And the water caused the damage. There's a community on the water. The water made the roads impassable, so you can't live with it, can't live without it. But and for an area that's not always getting torrential rainstorms, it's much like California after a drought. Too much water turns into mudslides. So it's too much of a good thing sometimes.
One thing that you touched on, Brian, and you touched on, Tom, you touched on resilience, and you touched on the class system. And one thing that made me realize this wasn't somewhere in the United States was the aesthetics of it weren't there. The planning of roads and the segregation of my space and your space. But I have to imagine that a community like this very much exists together or dies together. They probably have a very good sense of community in that if somebody is going through a struggle, you're not going to have, well, that's his problem over there. You're going to be more apt to jump in and help your neighbor. And there's something to be said about what your relationship is to your place and to the water that you're living on when you feel that sense of responsibility for the person living next to you, instead of having this is my square that I have carved out of this space, and you don't come on my square, and I don't go on your square, and it's very individual, self-over community. That even though there are limitations to this setup, and it's certainly not what Americans might look at as aesthetically pleasing, and certainly not very navigable, it probably is much more of a community than we would find in a lot of places in the United States.
I would assume, looking at this, they do have a very tight, interwoven community, and, you know, going about your daily life here, I can see, you know, talking to 50 different people that you know and love on your way to pick up food or, you know, foraging for things. And that's one of the reasons that drew me to relocate to this area is a different type of community. I'm a transplant from Detroit. I lived there for 10 years, Battle Creek before that. And there's something about this area, and there's a different way of life. It's a different pace, you know, and people are a lot different with their neighbors here too, and that's something I also really admire.
Do you think water contributes to their healing?
I think so. I definitely think that water has a lot to do with mindset. Just going to get groceries for me is a very calming experience, as opposed to, you know, fighting traffic on a major highway. I can look at beautiful Lake Michigan in the bay here every time. It's a really wonderful thing that I'm fortunate to be able to do.
Yeah, I recently saw a video on Facebook, and it was a gentleman that is a marine biologist, and he talks about the physiological, the physical, the emotional, the things that happen to us when we're in contact with water, whether you're taking a shower, whether you're in the lake, and whether, you know, auditorially, how, and he's doing that scientifically. The book is called Blue Mind, and it's just like, I was like, oh my gosh, this guy, he gets it. So it's even though the people along the Mississippi that they're flooded and all that, you have to have some respect for that water, and you can't control it. It is gonna do whatever it's gonna do, but at the same time, having the respect is like, you know what, I need this to exist. I need this to live, you know, and those people that are flooded and all that, it's like they can see that they have very little control over the environment, and that's like, that requires a lot of respect. At least from a tribal perspective, that's how we look at it. It's our relationship with it, how to coexist with it, not like, I mean, if you try to set up a dam and there's a flood like there is along the Mississippi, that water is gonna find a way to get around the dam. It's just that powerful.
You mentioned something, you've said it a couple times now, and that is respect for the water, but you also said something about encouraging people to have an emotional connection with the water. And Lindsay, can you hand me that picture there? So this picture, I think when people think about, I don't know, maybe it's just me, life on the water, it's kind of this. It's the nostalgic, picture perfect, this is why I want to move to Petoskey image. I'm wondering, but at the same time, there are so many other realistic day-to-day issues that may not be so attractive that people need to worry about. Do you think people living in a community on the water have this emotional attachment? Because I may live here and I may go out and enjoy this, but am I going to be there to take care of it too? I mean, what do you see in the community in terms of that give and take, in terms of people's connection?
What scares me, and I need to get this out of my system, because if I'm here because of this, I took a 1,000-mile kayak solo last year at Lake Superior. And part of that is, in my heritage, is to live in the rhythm of the water and the rhythm of nature. I live better in the rhythm of outdoors than I do by somebody's rhythm with a clock and a computer. I've always been that way. And my worry is that everything like that, there's a dock, right? Everything we do around the water, unfortunately, and I'm being generalizing, we tend to want to commercialize, and we lose track of that rhythm. We lose track of that sense of place. We lose track of that whole environment that we have a connection with, which is around the water and the weather patterns and the earth and the environment that encompasses the whole 9 yards. And when we lose track of that, we lose track of what we're taking care of, and that's what scares me. And I saw that all the way around Lake Superior. Some communities did it better, some didn't. When I took the paddle from south of Duluth 12 miles up the St. Louis River, it came out into the shipping channels. It was black water and oil and pilings, and as a kid I used to think that was so cool, and now I'm in this kayak and I'm like, oh my God. I couldn't wait to get back out in the water and out into the wilds. So I don't know if that's where you're going with that, Amy, but that's when you show a picture like that, it worries me that it's just, it becomes a commercial way of life versus the rhythm of the water.
I also think you don't realize what you have until it's gone. So I think, like, that photo could be of a completely polluted, contaminated body of water. We can't tell from the photo. But I think we all have this cultural expectation that that water is pristine. And I think we tend to take that for granted almost always. I feel like we tend to assume water's good unless otherwise noted. And I think that's a given that we shouldn't always, that I don't know if we should be entitled to that, but I think that requires active stewardship and preventing things from happening. But I think we really tend to take for granted clean, fresh water, and everyone's up in arms as soon as it's not. But the rest of the time, it's just a picture, it's just an Instagram photo, it's just something to look at. But as soon as there's a catastrophe, everyone says, how could this have ever happened? And it's like, well, what were you doing to maintain that in your life?
But we've also been slowly watching these natural catastrophes before our eyes, Lake Charleroi and a million other lakes that are beautiful and clean, but they're not healthy because of zebra mussels, quagga mussels, name whatever. And they're fun to kayak and paddleboard and canoe or whatever, but when I was a kid growing up, you would go down to the docks and you would see schools of millions of minnows, not just a couple or a couple hundred. Millions of minnows. The water would be black. I can't tell you that I have not seen a school of minnows in any of our lakes, and that's scary.
What's the natural progression of the population as it moves up here? Like you'd mentioned, living down in Detroit, when you're out on the water in Detroit, it's completely different than being out on the water up here. We're really fortunate to have areas like Sturgeon Bay or Good Harbor Bay where when I'm out there paddleboarding 3 miles out, you see like maybe 2 building structures that you can possibly see on the shoreline compared to down there, and you don't see shoreline. All you see is buildings and boats and everything else. And that's moving its way up here. It wasn't like that, 200 years ago. Everybody wants to be, as all of you guys have made your way up here, everybody else is doing that too. How many more years is it going to be before that shoreline is gone?
Look at Traverse City.
Right.
Everybody went to Traverse City, but it's a quiet community, and nowadays will be Grand Rapids.
Right. It's starting to become.
I think we have to be a little careful though, because I've seen photographs of what used to be down on the waterfront here.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, it was an industrial area.
Oh, absolutely.
So
You're absolutely right.
be
Yeah.
so criticizing ourselves so much, because I think that the awareness of the lake, I don't think we do assume. I see every year, the Bear River people, the Watershed Council has 100 volunteers getting that river to clean it up every year. And that's without really the assumption. They're looking down the road and looking at trying to clean up the resource, and it's not what maybe the catastrophe happened 100 years ago, but there's people in there trying to clean it up. So I think there's a lot of people that care about this. I moved from Indianapolis, and as you well know, Indianapolis doesn't have a coast, and that picture is exactly why I moved here. So,
And you're right, but now it's. I mean, back then you're right. The river had logging. There was industrial waste. There was a mess. When I kayaked into Frida, just south of the shipping channel up in the UP and the Keweenaw, the western side, it's all black sand and tailings, and it's dead. You know, it's just like that all over around the Keweenaw. So you're absolutely right. It's just that now we know enough to not do that. And we just are, the fear is just that we do it, and there's so many more people and so many more cities that it's just at a greater extent. That's the word. Back then it was just a couple of things on the Bear River.
And back then, the primary mode of transportation was water.
Oh yeah.
Like, nobody says that they want to locate a factory in Petoskey and they're choosing the Bear River because then they can easily get it out into the Great Lakes to ship it, right? I mean, I think that's something where we've seen a great, you know, nationally and internationally, this shift of the water in many places is still an area for commerce, but in these smaller towns, that moved inland closer to highways, freeways, railroads. We changed how we move material from water-based transit to land-based transit.
That's what, sorry, Melanie. That's one of the things that I'm reflecting back on the community, the sense of community. There's a cohesiveness here where there's a similarity in how they're all interacting with the water. And in communities like ours, we have second homeowners, we have recreation. Some people look at that beautiful photo every day out their window, or they look at it on the weekends when they come up to their summer home. And then there are a greater part of our community that never see that unless they drive somewhere to a public location. A community like this is interacting with the water much more cohesively. There's many more similarities, and so I feel that there's probably not only a respect for the water, but greater knowledge, where we have so many diverse levels of knowledge of our Great Lakes, because we're all interacting with it so differently. Compared to a community like this, where they're dependent on each other as well as the water based on the layout. And we have, you know, large plots of land on the water for commercial, and then we have these small little 40-foot lots for residential, and so we're all interacting very different with the same body of water.
I think that idea of the layering and the leading to a disconnect, it's sort of ironic. I'll point out to the people listening that we're in a room with the walls and the shades pulled, and if we all just silence for a moment, you hear traffic, and yet the lake is here. And so it's, you know, I liken it just to these layers of disconnect, especially when we're living here day after day. What is that? What does our connection look? And these three people seated next to me are all, my understanding of your all connection with water is very direct. I mean, with the paddle boards and the paddling and the fishing, I mean, it's literally that contact. And last night I was at the city council meeting in Harbor Springs. They were talking about Marina Park, and I brought up under goal 2, objective 2, it says public access to the waterfront. And I asked, how do we define, you know, when we think about our waterfronts and waterfront access, have we thought about literally defining access as in touching? Are we able to literally touch the water? And in Harbor Springs, it's not accessible to the touch. And so I think about, I like using the word lakeful and really being intentional about bringing the lake into our everyday lives. Because I think without that intention, depending on I have to be very intentional about it, and with my children and my family and the work I do, because it's so easy for those layers to build up, that disconnect to happen.
But you know, a positive in Michigan is that the sand is public. You can touch it. I mean, coming through Minnesota, where they own to the waterfront. I mean, you're chased off a beach. If you have to land because the water's unsafe, you literally have people chasing you off the water. And the same in Wisconsin. In Michigan, I could pull up at Wequitansing, just like I pulled up in the Huron Club and parked right in front of them and camped. They can't move me off.
But the rite of passage, right, the public, there's a rite of passage.
Well, so you're saying from the land to the water.
But I'm saying, like, back to this picture, how we develop our shoreline. Like in Harbor Springs, you either have to climb over the riprap. Right in Marina Park, technically, you have to lower yourself, depending on the year, down off the public dock, or you have to walk through the dinghy field, and for a lot of people, that's like literally physically not possible to
Gotcha.
navigate that shore, you know, the way it's been developed, even though it's public waterfront.
I would even encourage, when again folks have time to explore and learn, accessibility from my perspective as an Anishinaabe woman is much different. And thinking about how it was during my ancestors and those, so my grandma even, my great-grandma, my great-great-grandma, thinking back, accessibility was free. It was something that we could touch the water, we could carry the water back home. You know, even in my grandma's time, you could go down to the shore and not have to worry about private property signs, because not only was it accessible, but you had that respect of each other's property, right? You had that respect of the land and what was there. And I think, to me, this is an ideal. And it's an ideal that's been afforded to a handful of folks as time goes by. And I feel that accessibility, as you walk through the timeline of change here in this land, has changed, has shrunk, has become more guarded, has become more private. So I encourage everyone to take a look at how the history and the timeline of our shoreline has changed in and of itself for accessibility. And it's going to be different based on everyone's lens. Might be more nowadays, but it's going to be less potentially in many others, right? So how is that cared for? How is it accessed? How is it utilized? And just, I think this is a venue to have that conversation, is what are those lenses and what does this $1 million sunset, is that what this is coined? How is this applicable?
It's probably only $500,000 in that photo.
We're about some $2. You get a view of the bay for half the pay. That's the thing.
Oh, and that's the thing, when we have that ideal, we're economizing the water too, because we rely so heavily on tourism to seasonal work. So we have a lot of people working not full-time jobs that don't pay the best, and then where do they live? Because everyone's coming up and needing their second home, or their, you know, great big water view, and the people who live here, who are working those part-time or seasonal jobs, can't afford anywhere affordable to live, and we don't have great public transportation either. So and we have new public transportation, which is awesome, but for people who are being pushed into more of our outlying communities, getting to where the work is harder.
So what I like about the topic of access is, in our Michigan Sea Grant work, I think we look at stakeholders as being, you know, everybody in Michigan should have access to the Great Lakes, in the sense that our state is defined by the Great Lakes, our waterways are connected to the Great Lakes. Those Great Lakes benefit who we are in Michigan in a lot of ways, socially, economically, ecologically. So we think everybody is a citizen of the Great Lakes, so and that access, in my mind, gives everybody the empowerment or the sort of the commitment of taking care of those resources that's theirs. And I think of something my dad would always say is like, hey, if you don't care about your vehicle or your animals or your bedroom, why would anybody else care, right? And so if you think of these Great Lakes resources as a world resource, you know, if we're not interested in taking care of those resources ourselves, why would somebody in Europe or Asia want to do that for us? And so when you think of access, that access gives us the mindset of these are our resources, and they're our resources to care for. And then I think if you pick up that picture, Emily, yep. I mean, how many of you looked at that and thought drinking water? Right? So drinking water is fresh water, and 20% of the water on the surface of our Earth is right, we're surrounded by it, right? And so if you look at this as a global resource, how many people in that other picture are looking at that as a drinking resource, right? They're not interested in the view or the value of the property. So
or
access,
bathing, or washing, or
right? So
Commerce.
yes.
I guess my point of access, and you guys are talking a lot about access, is access also gives us ownership, and ownership gives us, you know, something that we can care of. And it doesn't mean ownership in the sense of I bought property. Ownership in the sense of these are my resources, my responsibility to take care of.
So the Great Lakes, I've thought about this a lot. You know, somebody told me they were talking about trying to pipe water from the Great Lakes to the west, to California or whatever, but and everybody says that's crazy. But we willingly and knowingly purchase, fruits and vegetables grown in areas that don't have the water to sustain it, and most of those fruits and vegetables are mostly water. And so I've been stuck thinking, like, do the Great Lakes belong to the states or the people of the states that are on the Great Lakes? Or do they belong to the United States and Canada? Or do they belong to the continent of North America? Or do they belong to the world? Right? Because
Right now, they belong to Nestle, and we're already selling all that water.
So that's
Yes.
it. Like, are they owned by the highest bidder, or is it by the tribes that have been here since time immemorial? Like, I think that's I think a question that many people have their own idea of who owns it. There's sort of that like gut or smell test when you say Nestle or California. That for some reason doesn't sit well. But yet people probably consume Nestle and California products all the time, and it has to come from somewhere. So I sometimes think,
Because I'm not going to give up my Kit Kat, although I know that Kit Kat's made by Nestle.
right?
But I got to put a face on the bad guy.
I do believe this is one of the fundamental. I mean, it's sort of like the tragedy of the commons, but in real time. Like, are the Great Lakes a commons, or are they attributed to the people that are nearest to them? I hear people in Petoskey and Harbor Springs speak with a higher degree of ownership of Little Traverse Bay than somebody from downstate, even with disdain. But
every one of them has bottled water in the refrigerator. Not everyone, most. I mean,
Right.
it's an amazing. We're in a culture right now where there's a huge divide where a lot of us are realizing the preciousness of this finite resource, but at the same time, we've been so commercialized, taken away from this lifestyle where we live in and breathe where we live and breathe, that we've bought into. It's I got a 14-year-old and I got a 5-year-old, and I hate the fact that my child reaches in and grabs a bottle of water everywhere I go, and I'm like, there's a drinking fountain right there. If you want something, bring your water bottle with you. I don't care where we're at. Bring your water bottle. I bring my coffee mug everywhere because I hate.
Well, let's get into the issue of accessibility and equality, and I'm going to bring it back on a more of a micro scale because I want to look from the lens of this area. And so what I want to do now is I'm going to have some crinkle mic. You might want to take off your headphones for a minute.
But our communities have a lot more people in the leadership, government boards where we're setting aside green spaces along our waterfront that aren't going to be developed, that we are thinking more, not 10 years down the road, but 100 years down the road. And there is that positive aspect, when we see each other at the farmer's market, there's spaces there that are green spaces that are always going to be green spaces, and that's why we gravitate. I'm a traveling sales guy, and I was in Columbus, Ohio 2 weeks ago. And I ran into a couple that used to live up in Cadillac. They said, we can't afford to live up there. That's why we live down here. We make such better wages. But we love coming up here and fishing and boating where you're at. Like, double-edged sword. I love having you, but I don't at the same time. And I can't wait to get home when I'm in Columbus or Grand Rapids or Detroit. I'm like, get me north of...
Well, and when you talk about creating green spaces and working together, seeing people at the farmer's market, the thing that popped into my mind is, so what about the people who can't make it to the farmer's market? What about the service workers in the community that are working when the farmer's market is open, or who don't have the transportation to get in at the right moment?
Or the farmers at the farmer's market who are working.
Right.
You guys part of it.
So when it comes to the use, the equality, the access, again, the question to me seems to circle back to who has that, and even within a community on the water, who has that. And so what I'm going to have you do with your fortune cookie is to go ahead and open it. I want to know what fortunes you get.
Are these meant to be as ironic as they are?
Collect all the plastic wrappers in that plastic bag and I'll take it. It's not a problem. We recycle plastic bags.
From the original photo to now, it's just like misplaced cultural misappropriation and individual wrapped plastic containers.
The irony is.
Yeah, It's palpable.
So also to add to the accessibility or ownership or that type of thing, from a Native perspective, that's foreign to us. Like she was sharing that, you know, in our ceremonies and all these things that we did as Anishinaabe, it was, like I said again, it's a relationship to the water. We don't own it. I mean, there is the Great Lakes Compact and things like that where there's an agreement between the United States and all those states that surround the Great Lakes. Hey, let's like watch out for this resource because it's common to all of us and that it's important to all of us, but ownership is very foreign to us. You know, it's like this is not mine, you know? I mean, it's like that saying is like you can't take it with you, you truly can't. So I guess I'm in the mindset that our water right now is in a state of emergency, and that we have a very limited amount of it available to everybody. Yeah, we do need it to exist. So how is it in my personal life that I live that way, knowing all these threats that are happening to my water right now? No, I do not buy bottled water. I carry a water bottle. I go to a Lansing, I go and I get water. I make that effort to do that. I try to limit my plastic consumption. Just, you know, there's things that I try to do. I'm trying to encourage my tribal community. Hey, at our functions, don't provide bottled water to our community. As tribal people, we should be the leaders in trying to make or not make these things happen. And then we try to think several generations ahead. That's the way that we try to. And I hate to call them resources, because that's like an ownership thing. Even stewardship thing is like, in our language, we don't, our perspective of these things that are around us, we coexist with them. We don't go and buy this, we don't own this, you know? So it's just a different perspective.
In that language, in the Anishinaabe language, there's an animacy to the things that as a colonizer we would see it's a thing, that tree is a thing, the lake is a thing, and when you look at Anishinaabe-Moan and other tribal languages, that's a living being. So the idea of coexisting with the water is as much coexisting with a living being as coexisting with this person next to me and this person next to me. So there's inherent in the language this idea that they're living beings, and why would you not protect those living beings, seeing that they don't have a voice to speak to you? They're relying on the people around to be that voice.
As we look at this, you need to get through the cultural, probably unhealthy packaging to get to what I'm using as a common resource. So this is representing our water. And my question is, when you open it up, I hope they did some fortunes that aren't wonderful. Did everyone get a good fortune?
Amy, I'm not trying to get another cookie, but mine didn't have a fortune in it.
It's actually disturbing quite a bit.
Would you like to share my fortune?
I'd sleep with one eye open.
Troublemaker.
If it happens again, I'm really gonna be attached.
So I look at that and I thought it was just an interesting way to kind of bring up this idea of we have a common resource, but what is our place in it? And some of it may come down to chance, and some of it may come down to planning and culture and history and, frankly, money. And so when we're looking at the $1 million or $500,000 view, do you have the dough to be able to enjoy that? Or are you too busy working in downtown Petoskey and then getting home to your kids that maybe you don't see it? So even with this culture of living on the water and having a sense of place, I mean, how diverse is that? And what are some of the factors that really impact that even on a micro level, even in this community? And I'm wondering, what you all have experienced or seen with that. And you look at the tribal aspect of that, the native aspect of that. And so there's this wonderful history of stewardship rather than ownership. And yet now this is viewed by many as a resource that they like to claim ownership of. And we need a law in the books just allowing people to walk on the shoreline, which fortunately in Michigan we have. However, good luck getting to it in some areas because you can't cross private property to do it. And so there's just been such a change in how it's viewed, and probably will always be. But I'm bringing it back to the micro level, and I'm curious as to, what kind of factors you've seen, what kind of stories you have, and what kind of, diversity we have right in this community, where we look at a community on the water, and yet there's just so many different perspectives.
Before Brian goes up, because I want to bring up his farm and what Lindsay does, what a lot of us do, and I am not native that I know of, but being from Alaska and having a lot of that culture in me, you came up here for what you wanted to see and be in this land. So those of us in this community, at least for me, who have turned my life in 10 years, no bottled water. We live minimally. I drive my car maybe twice a month. We buy all the local products we can. And when the farmers markets aren't open in this community, you can find them in the stores. And volunteering at Brother Dan's Food Market, I know for a fact you can actually live fairly cheaply buying real food than junk. It's just a matter of how we think. And our society, even in this microcosm of this community, tends to just want to keep moving fast. We're all wired. I'm not. That's my choice. We're all wired. We're all just going breakneck speed. And it is a choice. I know I'm pontificating, but it is a choice. And it's a choice you have to make to change what we're all talking about, and that is stewardship of the water, stewardship of the air, stewardship of everything around you. But it is a choice. And in this community, there's a lot of us, because we've learned those lessons, Joe, being around that water and what we saw in that river. And it's a choice to change your way of life.
Sometimes it's a luxury too, right? Like I think of a lot of, in the sort of global sustainability context, like it's a luxury to be able to care. Right? Like to even be able to care, you have to have achieved a certain quality of life that you're past. If you think of a sort of hierarchy of needs, that you're past the basic survival stage, that you have time to sort of put thought towards something. And I think about that often just in being able to care about what you eat, if you recreate. Even thinking about what you eat is in many ways a luxury. And I think even to not be wired or to not drive is sometimes a luxury, or it's at least conscious, and it's at a certain.
I was going to say it's consciousness, not a luxury, because you can make the choice at any point in your life.
But yeah, right. And I'm just saying, like I think that once you're at that point, I think about it often, like when you're talking about on a micro scale, how do we interface with water? I think it's very sort of revealing when for the people that access the water in this area, when they say how or where they do it. I think that's very indicative of your level of access, right? Like, do you access it off the back lot of your home on the lake? Do you access it in the northern parts of the county because you don't want to be around other people, or you live there, or you think it's better there and you have the time to go there? Do you access it through the state park, or do you access it along the break wall in your lunch break because you only have 15 minutes? Like, I think how you interface with the water, even in our own community, speaks to your degree of access, just what's even possible. And I think most people tend to get in a rhythm of accessing the water in somewhat the same fashion. You find your spot or what makes you comfortable, and then you sort of keep doing it. But I think there's a whole host of things that go into how you're even able to access it in the first place.
Well, how you access it, and I'm curious about this too. I don't know if we have service workers or students here. And so I really encourage, I'm not going to call anyone out. If you're comfortable listening, that's great. But if you want to share, by all means, please do. Because I just wonder if there are people in the community who don't see the lake as a beautiful benefactor, but see it as an unnecessary. It's bringing people in. It's raising property values. There's not enough lower income or housing for working families, and maybe it's stereotypical, but I'm envisioning younger people graduating from high school who didn't choose this community like some of you did. They were born here. Do they want to stay? Can they afford to stay? Is there a place for them? The view is great, but it's not going to pay the bills. Well, for some people, I guess.
You've been reading our papers and you know our community. Yeah, no, there isn't a space for them.
And
I was born here and a lot of people don't come back. I've lived all over the world. I've lived in Europe. I've lived in big cities. I lived in Chicago for a lot of years. And I mean, I was saying that it's like a habit that's really hard to kick. Northern Michigan in general. And yeah, I could make more money if I lived somewhere else. But do I want to? No, not really. And the whole access, Brian, you were talking about, I did a case study on the Yellowstone River in college, which was exactly that. We went and interviewed people who lived along the Yellowstone and how they viewed that river. And some people used it simply for farming. Some people used it because they were fishing guides. Some people used it, just, it was in their backyard. They didn't really think of it one way or another. But I think you see a lot of similar mentalities here, but not necessarily the awareness of it, if that makes any sense.
I was also born and raised here in Petoskey, and I chose to return to Northern Michigan to raise my family here, not only because of the education in the public school system, but it was about the water, for sure. Hands down, the water is an integral part of this community, and being born and raised here, and now working for Emmett County Recycling for the past 10, 11 years, it's definitely, recycling has been a relatively easy sell to our community, and the fact that all you gotta do is look out any window from your point of your home and look at either the natural hills and scape of woodlands that connect to wetlands, that connect to the water. Asking people to sort their discards, put them out on the curbside or haul them far away to a drop site was kind of a no-brainer for Emmett County residents because they're invested in protecting everything that we have. So I look at it through that lens as well, and also as a newly elected city councilwoman here in the city of Petoskey, creating policy that protects the water and helping our community realize that one of the most imminent threats to the water in this area and throughout the Great Lakes is number one, that pipeline that sits under the Straits of Mackinac that's ancient, antiquated, and 65 years old, prime for retirement, as well as we have 12 years to figure out climate change. So what kind of policy are we creating to not only mitigate that, what are things that people can do every day to mitigate climate change and protect the water by recycling, consuming smartly, composting your food scraps, reducing your food waste. I mean, all of those things are options and opportunities that we give to people every day to actually put their passion and love for the water and the community and the trees and the air and the legacy of protection and stewardship that has existed here for over, 500 years? I don't know, time immortal. It's been a pretty easy sell. So I'm invested in protecting the water and raising awareness and giving people tangible things that they can do every day to be a good steward of this place that we call home.
I definitely agree. And touching back on something that you talked about, Tom, earlier, a big part of our decision to move up here, as we've been coming up here for our entire life since we were children, is that we wanted to change our lives, particularly because we are thinking about having children in the next, whoever knows. But there's something that we have to think about also, and that is climate change. What kind of an earth can I really, this is a question that our generation has to talk about that I don't know if really other generations have thought about. And another part of changing our lives working up here was that, my husband and I are both artists. I'm a metalsmith, so I have to be especially careful and thoughtful with my waste products, trying to reduce these things. I filled up my gas tank for the first time a week ago since New Year's. We are able to dramatically change our carbon imprint up here. We've started growing our own food. We are switching our entire housing into an eco-friendly place that is just extremely efficient, and I think that's something that also this community values. And it's been a very, very interesting time getting to know people up here, learning about new ways that we can decrease our imprint and help keep this area not only beautiful, but healthy.
But then you brought up an interesting subject that I don't know if anybody's touched on. I thought Lindsay was, if I may, in your new position, but you talked about the housing, because the community is changing. People are buying all of our neighborhood homes and turning them into rentals, and they're bringing up their cars and their boats and not eating local. So this community, as much as we're talking about a lot of us trying to change, there's a lot of folks that coming up are taking a different advantage of it. And that's why there isn't affordable housing for the most part in Harbor and Petoskey for young people who do want to work in our places. And those people coming up expect New York-style restaurants and Chicago-type breweries. And if you don't have the young people around, it ain't going to happen.
You wanted somebody from the service point of view. I managed the Perry Hotel when we first moved up, and we would bang out 50 weddings in the summer between the Rose Garden and the Rose Room, and having that influx of people every weekend, 2 or 3 weddings, that's the money and the taxes that give us the better schools, that give us the better roads, that give us the benefits that we live on year round. But I had to make a sacrifice coming from Grand Rapids that I wanted to live a better quality life and be up here, miss out on my summers because I was there from 7 in the morning until midnight, 5 or 6 days a week missing my kids. But you can't drive into town and come on 131 or down Resort Pike and not see that reflection off the bay and just light up inside.
Right.
I mean, seriously, that's just there's no word that covers that.
I drive along Bayview and see it for 45 minutes because you're stuck in traffic.
Better yet, ride your bike and you
And
get it
that's
all the way along the wheelway.
I drive and get my bread that way.
Every day, yeah.
I do think that 131 is something I've talked about with a lot of people where, like I don't know who originally laid out 131. I know it was built.
Probably Indian Trail.
Yeah.
So let's say that it was, like, the fact that that is the approach into town, I think has a profound, if not subconscious effect on everybody every day from the first time you come to the last time. And I think, I don't know how intentional it was if it was an Indian Trail before, that sort of that experience of cresting the hill. Obviously that would predate, vehicles or any number of things, but I think whether you're hiking anywhere or you're walking or you're driving, that experience I think is sort of a profound human experience of this cresting of a hill. And I think the fact that when you crest what you see is water, I think, they say everybody lives in a watershed, but we're just a lot closer to ours. And I think it makes it easier to connect those dots. And I think it's harder to feel like it's somewhere else. We can see it right in front of us. And I think it's wise that those views are an important part, because though that photo is not maybe the original intent, I do think having part of our daily life exposes to that makes you more connected. It's proven that people care about things that they interact with more often. So I think the fact that we're able to interface with it, even if it's just visually or on the way to work too early or too late in the day, it sort of becomes a part of you. And I think that's I think it's subtle, but I think it's important, because that's a very mediated experience, being in your car on a highway, navigating other cars. But then all of a sudden, it's just, I'm surprised there's not more accidents when you see that. Just
I'm curious about what you're saying there, is I've thought about that approach quite a lot. When I first came up here, my ex-wife came over the hill. I'd driven the whole state of Michigan she'd come up here sight unseen, and she didn't get it until we went over that hill. And yet I complained about that hill all the time because some architect believed that that brick he put down there called a hospital was the appropriate thing to place there. And there's my ownership and my indignance right there, you know.
Well, I think this brings up several different points, and my mind is reeling from all these really great comments. And thinking about the work that we do and some of the work that I've done through Extension, sustainability, right? Looking at sustainability. And I think with what Lindsay and many of our folks here in this room, and historically speaking, and to this day, what LTBB and many similar tribal nations, not here and also across the country, if you will, in the world, looking at sustainability, looking at that traditional ecological knowledge that time immemorial folks have thought of sustainability, have thought of caring for that which is around you. And I think Extension and other programs such as that, as I mentioned, are an exciting, and it's a great way to make sustainability, to make that education palpable and realistic and something manageable in everyone's life in one way, shape, or form. And I just had a conversation today with a couple coworkers from Wisconsin talking about leadership. And Brian, you mentioned the word caring. Like everybody, we're all leaders in our own way. We all care about something. Whether you moved here, whether you came here 20 years ago, 30 years ago, been here for time immemorial. Like everybody cares in their own way about something. And right, so folks, whoever you might be, see this in different ways, but you know people care about this parcel of land to which they're on, right? So people care. It's finding that connection and that consensus and that commonality to caring, and that's water. And I think many of the things that we've talked about, back in Extension and, academia is how do you connect that research, what's happening to everyday lives of people? And that's what folks do here. And that's what we've done, I think, back in our home for many thousands of years. And one story that resonates with me when you think about sustainability and caring for your community, I learned a lot of what I do, recycling, from my parents. And I remember waking up in the morning, going along Sturgeon Bay to pick up cans, right? You took that time as a family to care for the environment. You pick up trash and you walk by it. You see a drain that's overflowing with leaves and debris. You clean it out for your neighborhood. Like that to me is leadership. That to me is caring for your water, caring for your infrastructure, your society, for one another. And I think, and this, to me, right, I mean, there's a lot of potential issues that you see here, but you also you do see organization. You see waterways, you see commerce happening, right? It's not just haphazard. There is a thought, there is a plan. And for wherever we are in the station of life, man, you gotta bring that with you, right? You find a way to care for what environment you can that which you're in. And I guess that's what's exciting about what we're hearing today is that opportunity to do that.
Well, and we're gonna need to wrap it up because I wanted to get you out of here on time. But the opportunity is still there. So many of you are already taking advantage of it in your own workplaces, in your own lives, in your own homes. But one of the things we wanted to really do with this group too is to provide some connections, maybe with people you haven't had a chance to talk to before. So if there's someone, as we've talked today, that they had a thought, they had an idea that caught your ear, we still have cookies left and some coffee. And feel free to stick around for a few minutes if you like and chat and get to know someone. Maybe pick up a business card if they brought one with them, or get their phone number if there's something you'd like to talk about later. We are going to be using this conversation, as I said, for an hour-long special that will air on WCMU Public Radio at a later date before June, which is the end of our grant, and then also some material that may go up on the web. We will be sending you an evaluation via email in the next couple days. So if there's something with the conversation today that you thought worked particularly well, or that maybe we could do differently to make it a better conversation, by all means, feel free to share that. I'll just mention it now, so if there's something in your mind, you can just make a note of it. And I feel like we could go on all night.
Can I say one thing about the conversation?
Yeah.
I think this is, in many ways, this is, just one big echo chamber. And I think this conversation would be really interesting if you just stood on the corner of 131 and Mitchell and picked like every 15th car and made one of those people sit in this room. Because I think, I mean, we were all sort of a part of this or invited or recommended to this because of some affinity or affiliation with the water. And so of course our narrative is about caring about the water, but it's not maybe totally indicative or representative of the community at large. And I think that discord is what anybody who cares about anything runs up against. And I think, I just think that sometimes so often happens. I don't think it's wrong that we're all in this room. I'm just saying the conversation would look awfully different with a more representative cross-section of our community. And you see this sort of detachment, whether it's in, you know, elected officials from the top to the bottom, where they're either in a different point in their life or they're of a different way of life or different means, that it's not representative of the community that uses it. And I think that's where so much of these issues where the rubber hits the road or where you run into challenges, I think we romanticize the Southeast Asian community far too much. I mean, if you've been on the ground in one of those communities, I think that most of those people are surviving, not just, you know, Mr. Rogers' neighborhood on the canoe, right? Like, I think it's a fundamentally different experience. And I think there's a lot of people in our community where it's a fundamentally different experience. They're driving by the bay, but like in between appointments with you know, underserved healthcare, inadequate access to food, and everything costs too much. And I think that sometimes we reap the rewards. Sometimes the waterfront property boosts real estate taxes, which boosts the school system and everybody benefits. But so much of the time, we don't all. And I think that this, you know, we're all in here because we care, but there's, you know, tens of thousands of people that are affected by the same things we just talked about that probably have a very different perspective.
What's interesting about that too is part of our charge and part of our interest in this conversation was reaching out to underserved, you know, people who are less commonly heard from. So it could be students, even high school students, college students, it could be lower income people, it could be those with maybe a disability. And so we made a particular effort to reach out to those folks, and yet we didn't get them in the room.
And
And
this is
so
working two jobs,
because
and
they're
they're in
Exactly.
places, and they only have one car in their household, and,
Right.
or they're.
Oh yeah, don't get me wrong, I'm not pointing fingers at them.
I know,
I'm
I
saying,
totally get it.
I know exactly what
This
you're
is,
talking about
I
too.
mean, this is the crux of
Fully
being able to show up to vote or to show up to do anything is to be. I'm saying to be able to care is already. Maybe luxury is the wrong word, but you're already above a certain tier
It's right.
that you're able to care.
It's absolutely right, because the word, like, just think about the word power, it comes from the word poder, which means to be able to.
Right.
So to be able to do anything, take action, attend a meeting, run for city council, do numerous of those things, you have to have some access to power.
Yeah.
Some of
For
those
sure.
people might even be bottled water drinkers.
Of course they are.
Of course, because the tap at their house
Because
might
it's
not be
important
the
to drink
best
water.
water, because the cleanest water doesn't go to everybody equally.
And the best indoor plumbing.
Right.
If I could, I'd like to let you know that one of the things that we just finished doing in public broadcasting down at WCMU is we received a grant from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting to perhaps do more local programming. And the first grant that we got moving in that direction was to research in 3 communities what the issues are, you know. And we were able to talk to 12 to 15 community leaders in a variety of roles in Traverse City, Petoskey, and Alpena, 3 pretty distinct communities from each other. And what was really interesting to me as I did these interviews was that the issues are still the same. The communities are really different, but the underlying issues are still the same. And those people who aren't as well off as many are, the people in the, I'll call them upper echelons, the community leaders, are aware of that in many cases, and my sense, and I felt really good about this as I had conversations, is that they do care. But they have the same problem that I run into when I try to do this, with trying to gather people together to address issues and reach solutions. And so they're inviting us in wholeheartedly to do programs about the issues that they've identified and make them open to the public. Some will be small conversations like this, but others will be kind of a y'all come, this is what we're talking about. And so I appreciate your bringing that up.
And I didn't mean it as a full-fledged sort of critique, but I think like, I
think
listen
it's
to
a real
public radio,
problem.
but you just, it always ends up being an interview with some researcher in some field and not one of the subjects of the research. You just end up with calling the 12 community leaders and not the people they're charged with leading. And that's not a critique of this forum. I'm just saying, when we talk about something as simple and universal as water, there's already this agency bias in who's able to be in the room to discuss it.
It's a pervasive problem, absolutely, it's definitely a challenge, I agree.
Yeah, the people at the grassroots level, that like are doing the work, it's like, you always have to get somebody with the college degree. We are right there on the forefront of trying to protect the water. I don't need a college degree in order to figure out that I need water to exist every day, that it's sacred, that it's, we use it and coexist with it in our everyday life. I mean, it's like, I don't need a college degree to do that. I don't have to have a PhD or, whatever. So, I mean, when you say experts, there's experts at the grassroots level that live it every day. You don't have to have a degree in order to, they know very well what it is and what it's not.
Well, if we have the opportunity to get back here in any timely manner, which we
None
would
of us
love
will
to
be in the
do.
room.
We'll never, Since I think we have your email, we will reach out and each of you get to bring one or two folks who might not otherwise be here. You were in that community.
That's a good idea.
I was at the good church, I heard it was Friday.
Yeah.
Yeah.